So let's move forward. How do we standardize this? Well, the first thing to do, we've talked about before, very useful little trick, is that you can name your data. So I'm going to go and select all the data I have here under stress. And I'm just going to call this stress. So I've named that whole series of data now stress in this top left column. So whenever you select cells, you can go up here and change the name. And this will allow you to name your data sets to reference later, which just speeds things up if you're doing analyses with it. So now I need to know a few things about stress. First, I need to know what is the mean for my stress data. So I use the command here equals average, and then I put stress. You could also select all the cells or type in the references. So here I've done the average of stress. Okay, so we see here that the mean for stress is 21.29. So the next thing we need to know is what is the standard deviation. So we're going to do equals standard dev for our stress. Okay, and so our standard deviation is 12.5. Now here I used the command equals stdev stress being my data set. Remember, if you put stdev, Excel defaults to doing sample standard deviation, which is typically what you want. If you wanted to get a population standard deviation, you could do the standard dev p, which does population. Okay, we're going to use the sample standard deviation here instead of the population one. So we have the mean and the standard deviation. If we wanted to get the variance of stress, and like I said, it is just the square. So if we took our standard deviation and we squared it, we notice that that is the exact same value we got with the VAR command, VAR stress, right, which gives us the variance. So now if we wanted to say, this data is normally distributed with a mean of 21.29 and a variance of 156.04, that is a full description of the normal distribution of this data. Now, if we wanted to make this data standard normal, we have to make it a normal distribution with a mean of 0 and a variance of 1. Now, of course, if your variance is 1, the square root of 1 is 1, so both the variance and standard deviation would be 1 in this case. So if we want to turn a set of data that's got an average of about 21 and a standard deviation of about 12.5 into a distribution with 0 and 1, we can do this really quickly using the standardized equation. Now, we could go compute z-scores by hand. So computing the z-score by hand, what we do is we take an individual score. So for example, the first person here has a score of 30. We subtract from this score the mean for the data set. So we would use the average for the stress. Make sure to put that entire thing inside of parentheses if you're going to write this all in one command. So the first thing we've done here then is what we call centering our data in statistics. We've taken any score that is at the mean and now turned it into a 0 because we subtracted the mean. And so centering our data tells us how far scores are from the mean. Now, this next step of the z-score equation is to standardize these centered scores. So we standardize by dividing by the standard deviation of the scores. And what this does now is it tells us how far scores are from the mean in standard deviation terms instead of in the original units. So by doing this, we now have scores that will have a mean of 0 and a standard deviation or variance of 1. And so this is the equation for standardize. So we see, for example, that this first score has a z-score of 0.7 if we round. So what if we just use the standardize function? So in Excel, we can type in standardize. You would select your score for X. You put in the mean. So here I'm going to get my average for my set of data stress. And then I need the standard deviation for stress. Okay. Once we've done that, let's see what we get. The exact same score when we compute it by hand. So why do it all by hand? Now, once we've done this, I can just autofill all the way through to get all of my z-scores for this data set. Now, what I did there was I got this little box in the corner. My crosshairs turned black. You can click and then drag to autofill. You can also double click and it'll autofill very quickly through whatever the apparent series is to Excel. So this allows us to get these values very quick. Let's see what happens now for our set of z-scores. So I'm going to get this and I'm going to name this set of data my z-scores. Okay, so let's see. Our average for z-scores, this is 0, in case you can't read this. This is scientific notation. So this says that the average is negative 5.18796 to the power of negative 17. So you'd move the decimal over 17 spaces. So this is, for all intents and purposes, 0. The only reason it's not 0 is realistically rounding error. So we've now created a mean for z-scores, in fact 0, like they should be. Okay, and if we made this be in numeric format instead of in scientific notation, we see that in fact it will tell us it's 0. We'd have to go out exceedingly far in decimals to find a decimal place value way down here. So you see that this is 0. The mean for our data set is 0. Now, what about the standard deviation? So we get the standard deviation of our z-scores, and our standard deviation is 1. So you see that this standardize command has taken our scores, which originally had the mean and standard deviation above, and has made them standard normal scores with a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1 in a relatively quick way. All right, so that is standardizing scores in Excel.